Hey, Luke, good day. Thanks so much for joining me.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, I appreciate it. And before we get into your background and commenting on why I'm wearing this hockey jersey, I wanted to give the audience, like in every episode, an idea of what is the ideal outcome for them. And so in this episode, we're going to get an understanding of your perspective on development in soccer players today in America, football everywhere else in the world. But we're going to be talking about soccer in America and what they can learn based on both your experience in England with a couple clubs, which we'll get into, as well as the MLS, because you're now currently performance director at San Diego FC, the expansion franchise in MLS. And that's going to include your take on the role data plays, or should it play if you're not if you don't have that perspective on being all in the data when it comes to especially evaluating where a player is given their level of play. So does that sound good for you?
Perfect. And just as not to give it away, but I probably fall somewhere in the middle of how but we'll get into this in more detail.
Yes, and I think if folks have listened to prior episodes, they will see that it's usually somewhere in the middle. Everything's about balance, even though this is about data in sports, as we'll get into. In many ways, like in anything in life, things usually fall somewhere in the middle, but we'll go into the data as well. Now, before we get into your background, people might be asking, why is this guy wearing a hockey jersey? Well, it's very hard to see on the camera, but this is actually Sheffield Sheffield Steelers jersey and the EIHL in England. And I was just mentioning before, you had spent some time at Sheffield Steelers. I actually have an England kit on below this, and this is a first on Data in Sports. I said, Luke, you're going to have a chance to play producer for a second and choose what it is that I wear. But then you told me you're actually from Sheffield. So let's use that as a segue into your background, maybe starting from there.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, basically raised in Sheffield. I say that I'm from Sheffield. I'm a Yorkshireman first, and then I'm English, and then I'm British. So very proud to be from the area of Sheffield that I was born and raised, right on the edge of the Peak District. It's a beautiful part of the world. The one that I give a correlation to the American audience is it's very much the steel city. It's very much like Pittsburgh. It's a old
Yes.
steel working class very much area, but we're as I say, almost a bit like in those Pittsburgh, just on the edge of the country. And it's a great place. I was born and raised in the area, and that was sort of where my interest for sport came from. From all the way from we were right on the edge of a great sporting facility. Of course, we ended up with the AIS in Sheffield, but then with such a diverse mix of sports from outdoor and adventure, from fell running to mountain biking to rock climbing, and then all the way through to our traditional sports, but fundamentally being English, we're all about football, football, football. And we refer to ourselves as a football club here. So we're a football club in the soccer industry is how we turn it here at San Diego.
Very nice. Yes. And I had mentioned to you, this was when I was living in London. It was the 2018-19 season or ice hockey season where I just took the train up, went to the match, slept at the hotel, took the train back. But now, based on what you said, I think I have to go back. I'd love to see another hockey game because, the atmosphere is like amazing. Not just for England, I would say, because it's not, I think people in England and the UK don't even know that like ice hockey exists. Though those in the hockey community, like I think everywhere else in the world, they're very into it. And I could definitely see that in terms of like how warm they were to me. So I think that's a funny thing that we learned. Not a funny thing. That's an amazing thing that we've learned so far because we didn't plan that. We didn't prep for it. And I was asking are you actually from Sheffield? Because you had, again, spent some time at the Steelers. So can you, before we get into your professional experience or the practical experience you have, can you share to what extent your educational background in terms of, I guess in the United States, it'd be undergrad or college, and then your master's and doctorate helped you set you up in terms of the foundational components of study that you now apply into your practical experience. So we can like set the scene for folks to get a sense of like, where does some of your perspective come from the educational side?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is, and actually my doctorate supervisors are in town here in San Diego, so I've flown all the way from England. They're working with a few people in senior positions in the MLS, but they've been here and we're actually reflecting upon this, I suppose. So I didn't go straight to college, university, straight from leaving high school or secondary school. I actually took a little bit time to go into the workforce to establish what I wanted to do. Originally, I was meant to be going to do quantity surveying, and around the time of the housing crash in 2000, or the market crash in 2008, and sort of delayed that. And through that period, I was very much always interested in sports and human physiology in particular. I was fascinated about how the body could adapt or how it became a product of its environment to bring about success, both from technical perspectives, but also physiological perspective. And of course, at that time, it wasn't maybe the terminology I would have used, but watching TV shows like Trans World Sport and just being fascinated with guys that are surfing or they're skateboarding down a mountain or they're playing soccer or they're playing American football. And for me, I was just always captivated by that and the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, whatever it was. Where 2009, I decided to go to the University of Derby. Reason being, at that time, there was no dedicated strength and conditioning courses. I had a knowledge around American sports, and strength and conditioning wasn't really a developed practice in the UK market at that time. But the undergraduate degree at the University of Derby had a strength and conditioning pathway and strength and conditioning modules due to basically a lecturer called Dr. Phil Watkins, and he sort of shaped it. So I went to university with the idea that I was going to become a strength and conditioning coach, and I had a very clear idea that this was going to be the pathway that I wanted to be on. I was a coach. I wanted to go and create meaningful interventions with athletic populations, and that was the pathway that I took from that perspective, and that sort of then led. I went straight into my master's degree. I was working full time at this time, and I had some research questions ultimately, and that's why I did a master's of research as my postgraduate study. And then again, a real practical example, when I started my first doctorate at Liverpool John Moores University back in 2018, which was assessing isometric strength, came again from a real world practical challenge that I wanted to investigate more and figure out whether us as a coaches needed to invest our time and an effort into this philosophy, basically. Unfortunately, COVID came and I had to manage, I suspended my studies with Liverpool John Moore, so didn't finish that doctorate, but then I restarted a PhD program at Teesside University just over a year ago, and my first paper is currently in review and we're at the point of second study. But again, I went to Teesside University with a research question and research ideas, and that's where we're at. So it's always come from a very much a practical like mindset opposed to an education first, and just education being the transportation to bring about the knowledge, but the importance being its transfer into the real world applied market, basically.
I appreciate that. And we will, throughout the episode, in the sections that we cover off, maybe we'll end up bouncing around a little bit back and forth. So we'll have advice at the end when it comes to younger players, footballers, soccer players. And though one of my takeaways from what you just said, because I also speak with, in prior episodes, we have someone who just graduated from college, someone who's actually in college, Takedo's in college, Jason just graduated, and they're taking a similar approach in terms of like, I want my study and the work that I do to be practical. So I believe there's a takeaway there for others who might be listening. Maybe they're in high school, maybe they're in college, where it's fun, and I'm not advocating for this necessarily, and I'm not a parent, so I can't speak it from the parental perspective, because my parents said, you're going to college right away. I was the first in my family to go to college. That was very important. So I didn't have a choice. And anyone that has a Polish mother or Polish parents knows what I'm talking about. Though the lesson or some advice there could be like, have the outcome or have an outcome in mind of what you want to do, what you want to get out of something, and use the education to help give you foundation, or as Darcy Norman put in episode 1 with his time at Exos, like this scaffolding that's going to help put structure to the work that you do.
I had a very clear vision. Everyone just wanted to be physical education teachers, and we sat around a large auditorium on day one. It's like, what profession do you want to go in? And I was the only person that sat there and said strength and conditioning coach. And ironically, my best friend from college, who's now the head of performance at Nottingham Forest, like he reflects back, Adam Burrows, like, you were the only one that like said you wanted to go into professional sport at that point, and you were just the odd one out. But again, I think as Darcy put it was very much the scaffolding to give me the tools to be able to go and operate in the field was very much my purpose for education.
Yeah, I love that. And can you, before we get into like your, and maybe, well, okay, I'll put it this way. Before we get into your approach to data, examples of applying it to practice, especially when it comes with, we'll use the term soccer players throughout to make it simple in terms of evaluation, development, and then advice that you give to them. Can you speak to lessons learned in England prior at Derby, at Sheffield, prior to coming to America to help? Because I believe that will help juxtapose perhaps some of the nuances or differences with soccer in America versus soccer in England. Or we can take it as approach that throughout we can do the juxtaposition. But if you may, can you give a couple, at least maybe a couple sentences or like a
Yeah.
high level 30,000 foot view of some of the nuance or difference when it comes to football in England, soccer in America?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is one in England, soccer is the number one sport. So, from a number of people within academy programs, in terms of the resources, in terms of the information around the sport, it's very much that's the number one sport. Of course, here in America, we're looking at fourth, fifth most popular sport. So, it's a very different market. And even in my 3 years here in the US, you've seen how the sport of soccer is growing and seeing the amount of playing fields now with young boys and young girls and our academy program here at San Diego FC challenging some of those traits or practices here with pay to play and private academies. And the academy system here at San Diego is a lot more akin to what we would see as being more common in a lot of the larger European leagues. So, from that perspective, I think just culturally, we're seeing a real rapid growth of soccer here in the USA. And then, secondly, from an athlete perspective, the athletes that I've worked with, in particular, that have come from Europe and are playing in the MLS, but just the physical demands in terms of the amount of games that are played in the English league, especially where I spent most of my career working in the championship, the amount of league games, so 46 league games plus potentially 3 cup competitions, is very different to what we see here in the US in the MLS, and is also one reason why I wanted to come to the MLS. So, of course, the first 18 weeks of the season here in the MLS are 1 game weeks, so we just play pretty much every Saturday at 7:40 p.m. And that gives us the chance to create meaningful interventions, to train, opposed to just being in this process of play, recover, prep, play, recover. And for us as a human performance department, both across performance, medical, nutrition, and psychology, it gives us this opportunity to actually create interventions, which is why we're here as practitioners and we're here as a department to make meaningful changes for these athletes. And so, yeah, I'd say they're the big two: culture around the sport and very much the, shall we say, capacity, robustness, whatever word you want to attach with that,
Mm-hmm.
but the ability for players to play week in, week out, multiple games a week, 3 games in 8 days. There's definitely a difference.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In these episodes, when data and sports from folks who have come from Europe, practitioners from Europe that come to America and now work in America for clubs, so regardless of sport, mostly football though, in this context, or soccer, say similar things in terms of just the culture of soccer in America, whole development program. It's slightly to very different to the rest of the world. And we won't go into that detail or get into that today, though I hear similarly. And then also, I need to make a correction. Clearly, I have ice hockey on the mind, and I'm looking at myself wearing this orange jersey. I said that you were at Sheffield Steelers. It was Sheffield United
United,
FC.
exactly.
I need to give
Yes.
the respect to Sheffield United FC. I believe, though, their mascot or logo
Yeah,
still the Steelers or the Blades.
Still the Blades, yeah. And we are
Blades.
literally training grounds are within a 5 to 10 minute drive away from one another. We're very closely linked. So yeah, it's I spent close to 7 years at Sheffield United, who was my boyhood club that I supported. So a cool time. But again, going back to that point, and I think there's some of those nuances between the cultural aspect are both positive and negative, and they're just a different market. Now, I think
Yeah.
from sports science, if we look at all of the major league sports here in the USA, whether that's baseball, football, basketball, hockey, they're all entrenched with data as part of the culture of the sports. Whether we go back to 100 years ago, people sat in the stands at Camden Yards with their own scoreboards, like where everything's so data driven in the NFL, for example. And I think partly what I've seen in my experiences here, a lot of the data side that we, of course, being a sports science department, have entrenched within our culture and our daily processes is very much, I'm not going to say more accepted, but it is more common language. And of course, because the sport's newer. A lot of the coaches, especially the American coaches that I've been exposed to, this is just part of their education process. This is what they've known, and US Soccer's A license and pro license have really set them up well with a great base knowledge to collaborate with specialists such as the human performance department here.
Yeah, for sure. So that's actually a nice segue into your high level or general point of view or philosophical approach to how data is used in soccer today. So can you give us that sense of what your take is, and then if or how it's adjusted or changed or grown through your experience over the years?
Yeah, I think, and this is going to start to make me sound really old, but over the 15 years that I've been working now in elite or professional football soccer, there's definitely been a switch. So I was probably second cohort of like the sports scientist that was working in the field. And traditionally, it had always just been a performance coach that was there just to run you into the ground to make you really fit. And that maybe some of those educational underpinnings weren't there. And I think that what we saw is we had guys that were just coaches, and that data has become part of our field. And we've seen a massive swing from the far right or far left to the complete opposite side. And sort of where I fall, and we have so much data within our department, whether that's data within the club, so the time that they're in the club, but then also data when they're outside of club, both objective and subjective, whether that's sleep data, whether that's skin temperature. We have so much information, so much so that we have a dedicated performance scientist within the department that's responsible for data processing and the the information that's disseminated from that. So then people such as the head of physical development, our athletic trainers, our physiotherapists can make meaningful interventions based around that, rather than us spending so much time processing data, which back in the day, 2010, 2011, I was building out these robust Excel spreadsheets. And basically, once we got to the end of the season, there was so much information in these spreadsheets that we press refresh to give us our report. And now it's suddenly taking 2 hours. Whereas we've got guys now that are going through education processes that are learning R, learning Python, which I think is great to an element, but we're never going to beat the people that have just data engineers. So how do we actually incorporate those people within our departments and not just look within sports science education processes, shall we say, or education courses? I think just being able to process that information to make meaningful interventions is key, but don't forget those that are in these roles is we're here to be coaches. And I think that's potentially there's been a huge swing to the opposite side. And now it's just like, we don't have our data. Well, go and speak to the player, be around the player, build those relationships and not forget those sides. Those guys that are strength and conditioning coaches, that are performance coaches, sports scientists, whatever word you want to put on it, don't forget this is a human-based industry. But
Yes.
all this data that we have has to 100% underpin everything that we do. And as long as we know that there's validity, reliability within our testing, or we understand the errors of the data that we have, then we can make more meaningful decisions or informed decisions opposed to just previous evidence or just going on a whim or on a gut feeling. So that's sort of where I started this conversation. Is it's probably somewhere in the middle is where I fall. But making processes more efficient and having more information and building on this information to make decision making more meaningful is, for me, it's obvious that it's not a bad thing.
No, for sure. And I've said this, I think, on almost every episode pretty emphatically, though something that a few things you said there tie to that high note for me, which is the context matters. Like the context matters. I am of the point of view, so I have over 12 years in B2B data. So in the corporate world, and they perhaps, or it is perhaps a few years ahead of just sport in general. And I hear very, very similar things when I speak with performance staff members at clubs of all sports. And these are my words, not theirs. There's too much data. And then there are these data companies popping up just saying, hey, here's even more data, though they may not necessarily understand context or the nuance of we'll call them problems, for lack of a better term, or problem statements that you're trying to solve for, being the practitioner. in the club. So I believe that that's right from my experience and my perspective, and what other guests have shared too, is it's not just about collect the data and now you have the answers. You need a point of view. So in terms of the data, and we could speak to San Diego FC, we could speak to prior experience because you were also at DC United with Wayne Rooney. You were with him at Derby, and then in Sheffield. And perhaps it's different in English football and U.S. soccer, though you referenced the academy at San Diego. Now, can you give us some insight into the following without revealing anything proprietary or behind the scenes? Is the club, or are you collecting, analyzing, synthesizing, and taking action on similar data regardless of the level the player is at? So they might be in the academy system versus first team, or is it different based on where they are in the progression of their career, which is usually correlated to their age?
Yeah, so I think there's two avenues we can go here. So with San Diego FC being part of the Right to Dream network of clubs, we'll have what I will term tier one testing. And that tier one testing, for example, is the same across all of our organizations, across all age groups. So let's take adduction squeezers, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The protocols that are delivered are exactly the same all the way across our 4 locations, or 5 locations, really, using exactly the same equipment. So we have standardization across the club, and we have, I believe, now close to 30,000 squeezers from boys, girls, men, women, of course, non-professional, professional, all the way down from 10, 12 years old, all the way through to professional. So it's really important. Those tier one testing are what we just would be your general preparation. With our academy, of course, we've got to be able to recognize and understand maturation status of those athletes. So we're not necessarily testing performance per se, but we're testing the journey of performance and what that looks like. So a lot of the introductory testing is very similar. We will then see that our testing, in particular post peak height velocity, post adolescence, basically, that the testing becomes aligned across what our pro teams and what our under 19 squads, for example, look like, and what our under 16s would look like. So that then becomes a point of ensuring as early as possible we have familiarization with all of our testing battery once we move out of that tier one testing. So then we've got a point where our testing is meaningful and we know that it's just not necessarily learning adaptations, and it's actually maximal force output in that perspective, whether that's an isometric test, whether that's an isokinetic test, for example, whether that's a jumping profile, whether that's force velocity based training or a force velocity profile, for example. We need to ensure that that the noise is reduced as much as possible. Very much our tier one is across the age groups and across our organizations. And as we move out of that, becomes more specific to player and performance ultimately.
I appreciate that. I wanted to ask something related to that because you've referenced like you're a coach you are coaches at the end of the day. It's a human-based business. So while we humans get communication wrong, sometimes communication is a key part of the work that we do. And that's in any work, any workspace in life. And I had heard something at the FSI, so Football Science Institute conference on high performance in soccer in June, where I forget the club name, but the performance director was speaking to, they do similar where they have specific standardized testing at the academy level through first team. And then what they actually do for the academy level players in the like, why is this important and how they communicate it to them is they show the academy level players some of the results of the first team cohort as a way to give them something to aspire to. Right. So can you speak to, let's talk about the communication aspect of this, like, breaking this stuff down for the player, regardless of age, explain like, hey, this is why this is important, and to what extent you may tailor the delivery of the message based on where they are in their development.
Yeah, so primary example. So our first academy cohort group here are fundamentally under 12. So we did our first battery of testing with them, and we have on our performance platform, we can access the data across all of our institutes and across all of our age groups. So on the TV behind them, where they were testing, it basically had average scores for under 12 boys in Denmark, under 12 girls in Egypt, for example, and they could see what that trend and that journey looks like to becoming a professional athlete. Now, whether you're 12 years old or whether you're a first team player, I'll cross reference Darren Burgess when he was at Arsenal, spoke around some wellness data, and basically a player just put that he wasn't his high wellness scores, and no one actioned this. So we take a lot of data, whether that's being Aura data, for example. The players have to understand why we're taking this data. We're not taking this data for the sake of just taking data. We're not taking this data to use it against them, that it's actually in their best interest for us to, again, I keep saying meaningful interventions, but this is what we're here to do. We're to support and to develop their journey and their pathway. So whatever data we take, we have to be confident in the data that we're receiving. So then once we make those interventions based upon that data, we have to be confident that we're making the right decision. And then we need to retest that in the future to show how effective was the intervention. Whether, again, that's wellness data that's taken. If someone's reporting information and we're not acting upon it, then that's a fundamental failure and a huge waste of time for anyone within this organization. If we give Aura, for example, we don't have 100% of our athletes using Aura. We probably have over 90% it will be using Aura. And out of that 90%, we will have 2/3 of those that we have access to all of their data. And then the other guys chose not to share that data. But for example, if it's a situation where someone is sick or they've got ill, then we can request their data and they will happily show us that data. And that just becomes part of us instigating conversations, whether you've reported whatever number being on your wellness survey in the morning. Once you arrive in this building, someone from the department needs to address that with you. It needs to inform and instigate conversations. It's fundamentally not wasting anyone's time, and it's informing practice.
For sure. And maybe knowing the most about ice hockey, I believe that they're in the collective bargaining agreement in the NHL between the league / owners and the Players Association. There are clauses that state as such, in that if the club is collecting data on the athlete, it has to be action. And in speaking with athletic departments at a few major universities in America, it's kind of similar. Their medical staff, or maybe it's medical staff, has a policy of like, you can't just like collect it for the sake of collecting it. We have to actually then act on it. So we need to understand the why at the end. So I appreciate you sharing that in terms of how you communicate to the players when it comes to the data. So before we get to what is actually the only named segment here on the episode of Behind the Data, you have given some advice through your experience so far in terms of the practical work that you're doing, especially with San Diego FC, that younger or developing soccer players can learn from. I'll say this to the parents too, like the parents play a big role in their development too, especially in this country. So this is good for them too, to hear and understand, to help instill those habits and help explain the why for their children. Though, are there areas that you believe in general, younger or developmental, say U12, U16, U18, that they should be focusing on as key metrics or measurables themselves, that they can, air quotes, pretty easily do to get a sense of, hey, here's a reality check, right? Here's where I'm at, because I think it's pretty easy with studies and stuff on the internet and social media to get a sense of what are some of these metrics of the elite players. There's a lot of data on that. Though, from your perspective, having been through what you have, what is the key advice you would give to those developmental players?
Yeah, don't treat them like mini professionals. They're a different cohort, and understand some of these elements of enjoyment and experimentation. But then also at the same point, we can feed into some of the benefits that we're now in a generation that understand more information, that whether it's the hand on the phone, whether it's the playing games, gamification of information, I think is a real critical one. Simple things: track height, track weight, see what these changes are over time. understand what maybe you don't specialize too early, but understand if you want to be a soccer player, like, are you a defender? Are you a creator? Are you a goal scorer? And what are the physical traits for doing that? And go and repeat them. Go and excel. Make these become your unique selling point. Hide your weaknesses and push your strengths fundamentally. And then how we can use information outside of the club. And these are just coming back to lifestyle. So what is our sleep hygiene like? What is our recovery capabilities like? How do we manage the day-to-day stresses of school to then formal training to informal training to play? And I think having information around that can be really meaningful. And again, the gamification of how did I sleep, or what did I eat, or why did I do that at that time, and being ultimately similar to the information of was selling, why we're collecting data with our professional athletes is what's the rationale and why should I invest my time into doing this? And the amount of the bandwidth of information is becoming closer and closer to the human body, probably to a point where it's going to be in our body at some point, whether
Yes.
that's on our wrist or whether it's a new glasses that's got information in my lens. It's certainly becoming closer and closer. And even we had a practical example at the club with a suspected cardiac arrest. And like the first part of call is the person had an Apple Watch on, so the medical team go to action and that they can use the Apple Watch in a real world situation. So that's the sort of a little bit of a tangent, but just talking about that bandwidth and the accessibility of information now.
For sure,
it's very different to a decade ago.
Yes, and I mean, even when I was in college, so I graduated. We were around the same age as we had discussed offline. So when I was in college, like we had none of this. I graduated in 2009, so I got into college walked on to a D3 hockey team, and it was like you showed up before practice, they took your weight. After practice, they wanted to show that you were hydrating. So if you lost too much weight from water weight loss, like that's a problem. Like that, and some of the workouts and like some body composition was the extent that we tracked it. And now it's a lot more accessible. Before we go to behind the data, I just want to also just make one comment on the sleep hygiene. I have very bad markers for sleep. I never understood why I slept poorly. Come to find out, a lot of it is in my control with sleep hygiene. And for the parents out there, they probably know this, but for the younger athletes and younger people listening, it's pretty scientifically known. As you get older, your sleep gets worse, regardless of what you do. It's just built into us. Like our REM sleep, our deep sleep goes down. You can help stabilize it to an extent through the hygiene, but like get your rest, get your recovery, be hydrated, be nourished, like do the basics. All the fancy stuff is great. All the stuff you see on TikTok and Instagram of this fancy training stuff is great. Starts with the basics. And you spoke to this, Luke, having been, I'll say, all over the world in terms of working in the sport. So if folks aren't going to listen to me, they should at least listen to you. Okay. So, no, please.
No, I'm just going to say thank you. I don't know if they will do, but again, I've worked in England, Norway, India, and now the USA, and some of the challenges are always the same with that age group of people.
Yeah, yes. And I have friends who are parents, and they tell me similar.
Exactly.
So this is coming from learned experience. So thank you so much for going into that level of detail with us, Luke. Now we'll finish with behind the data. So we started with you in terms of talking about your background, your experience, where you're from. We're going to finish with you going into it outside of sport. So this will be pretty rapid fire, and then we'll finish. So is there a place or a location that is near to your heart or very special to you? And if you want to share why, you can.
The Peak District National Park for me is one of the most fabulous places. Of course, it was on my doorstep growing up, but was a place to go and hike, to escape, to walk the dog, to go and cycle. The weather changes drastically, whether it's beautiful when it's raining, it's beautiful when it's sunny. But yeah, that's sort of the place that I probably miss the most, having been away from the UK now for the last 3 years.
I appreciate that. A place I did not go to when I lived in the UK for 2 years. So that I will add to my list. Moving on to food, and this could be homemade from like a family member, or it could be from a restaurant. Is there a comfort food that you have, or even it could be before matches, something that you have as a pregame meal?
Yeah, the bit that I'm going to say miss, I don't really have any rituals. The two things that I don't think are great here in the US market so far that I've come across is chicken shawarma is a very different meal, which I miss. I would make a lot back home. I don't want to get into the political bit. Oh, it's not really political, but chicken's very different here to what I'm used to. and then fish and chips. Fish and chips is so different here to what I'm used to. So yeah, so
Yes.
that's what that would say.
I'm with you on both of those. That we'll just
Yeah,
leave it at. It's very
yeah,
different here.
it's just different.
It's just different. It's okay
Yeah,
to be different, though.
yeah,
It's not what you are, what
no,
is familiar to you, and what is
exactly.
comforting for you, and that's the key point. Okay, last two. Is there a song that puts you in a very good mood, makes you smile, gets you excited, or just pumps you up?
Yeah, I'm not a huge music person. People that know me, I'm not a huge music person, but like three artists that I really like, I suppose, are like Tom Mish, Yusuf Days, and Malik. They're sort of like modern, jazzy, very chilled music. I've never been someone that would use music as a way of driving intention or motivation. I quite like to, some of my own training is done with AirPods in, silence, and just with my thoughts. But yeah, I'd very much more like to relax and maybe pre-bed to work on some of that sleep hygiene. Would they be three big names for me?
Awesome. Really appreciate it. Now, last but not least, is there a book that you've read lately, we'll call in the last year or two, that had an impact on you or taught you a lesson that you would recommend others check out?
Yeah, the first 90 days I thought was superb, and it's helped me transition in here to San Diego FC and gave me some frameworks and some ideas for how I would come into an organization and the impact that that has on myself, but also those around me, especially in a new franchise. Was very much a book that I read more than a couple of years ago, but I revisited before I moved here to San Diego. And then also a book that I read in me coming to the club was Good to Great. We spent a lot of time here onboarding our staff and creating an identity of the department. And I think some of the elements from Good to Great about creating not only a brand identity, but an identity within the department and having pride for product or organization has been something that was really resonated with me and something that we've worked on over the last year. So, yeah, first 90 days and Good to Great.
Appreciate that. I will have to check out First 90 Days, read Good to Great in business school. It is somewhere in my book stack, and it's one I like to go back to every now and then and check out. So thank you for that. Luke, thank you again so much for taking the extra time today during your season. We're recording this in September. This will be released, as we were saying before, potentially in the last match day of the season. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for you and for San Diego FC. And again, thanks so much for taking the time.
You're more than welcome, Malcolm, and thank you very much for your time.